Class is now in session. I am Professor Hockey, and today we're discussing Game 2 of the Sharks Rookie Faceoff tournament. This time it was against the defending Stanley Cup champions rookie team, the Colorado Avalanche. So there were a lot of names swapped out and in for this particular game. Not necessarily just players who necessarily played poorly in the previous game, but just to try and get a bunch of different players some extra game time. This is because of the fact that there were much more than just 20 players available to actually be playing in these games, and yet there's only 20 rosters or game spots for the lineup, and so you want to try and get some players in and out. Obviously, there are certain ones who you are targeting to try and play potentially all 3 games here in this rookie face-off, but some others, maybe they only get 1 look, maybe they get a couple of looks, we'll see. So on the first line, of course, we still had Eklund and Bordeleau, but for this game, instead of Scott Reedy, who actually had the night off, we saw Ethan Cardwell get promoted from the third line to the first line. I thought Cardwell in the previous game was pretty good, not necessarily amazing, but rather solid in his role, but clearly John McCarthy saw something slightly more than what I did, and I thought Cardwell actually fit in pretty well on this line, at the very least early on. You see, this was kind of a tale of two games for the San Jose Sharks, who, by the way, ended up winning this game by a score of 5-1. And while in that first period the Sharks were incredibly dominant and took a 3-0 lead, the last 2 periods were, of course, you could say still Sharks favored. They still outscored the Avalanche by a score of 2-1 in those final 2 frames, and then won the game 5-1 like I said, but it wasn't necessarily the same level of dominance. So in that first period, this first line seemed to be almost unstoppable at times. I was extremely impressed with Eklund pretty much every single time he stepped on the ice. The same would go for Bordeleau, and I thought Cardwell complemented those two very well. But as the game wore on, that kind of wore off a bit. Eklund wasn't necessarily as dominant as he was earlier on. The same would go for Bordeleau, and eventually we actually saw Cardwell get demoted a bit as Brandon Coe would take up his spot on that first line for multiple shifts near the end of the game. So it was an okay game from these 3 players, and in particular, if we're talking about Eklund and Bordeleau, it was an okay game for them, but obviously a bit of a downturn from the previous one where they each had 3 points, factoring in on all of the Sharks' goals. Here tonight, while the Sharks scored 5, they didn't get a single point between them. On the second line, we had Wiseblad, Robbins, and Coe, and this was also a line that saw a small shakeup. Yesterday, it was Gushin with Robbins and Coe, but Robbins and Coe still remain on that second line, and I had mentioned that that was probably the most disappointing line of the night for the San Jose Sharks, and it seems as though they took that criticism to heart, because this line was actually significantly better here. I'm actually going to focus at first primarily on to Tristan Robbins, who I believe the exact words I used yesterday was calling him invisible in that game, but he was anything but here tonight. Managed to get a couple of goals for himself, but I was also impressed in particular by his penalty killing skills. The San Jose Sharks were frequently actually down a man and sometimes even a couple of men during this game. They took a ton of minor penalties, and so I believe it was 3 times that the Sharks had to face off against the Avalanche 5-on-3. That was actually the only time the Avalanche managed to score a goal in this game, and frequently the player that the Sharks turned to on the forward side of things to defend these 5-on-3s was actually Tristan Robbins, and I thought he did a very solid job in that role. So I commend him certainly for being able to put up those 2 goals. You definitely want to see that offense from him, and he was significantly better than he was yesterday, but I also like that he has that defensive style of play as well. Then when it comes to Brandon Coe, he was another player who I was potentially even the most disappointed in last game. I was expecting some sort of incredible performance from him in the game, and we just didn't see anything of that. He was miscuing on a lot of his plays and just reading things quite poorly, but here tonight it was pretty much night and day as well. He was significantly better, especially in the first period where really most of the Sharks were very, very good. Coe made a lot of very good plays, some nice passes. He assisted on the one of the Tristan Robbins goals, the first one of the game, if I'm not mistaken, and it was generally a much better game for Coe, and we could see that to be the case by the fact that John McCarthy did indeed promote him up to that first line with Eklund and Bordeleau as the game wore on. And then the final player on this line was Ozzie Wiseblad, a player who had a lot of positive praise for in the previous game for being such a firecracker type of player. I didn't find that same thing to be the case here tonight. This was one of the players who took a bit of a step back, you could say, from their previous performance. This is, I guess you could say, to be expected. Remember, this is technically still a back-to-back situation here for this team. And so while many players were playing their first game of the rookie tournament here tonight, Wiseblad was not one of them. And for a player who plays with a lot of energy, and that's what we saw in the previous game, it's not necessarily that much of a surprise that it would take a slight step back here tonight because of the back-to-back situation. It wasn't bad. It's not as though he was completely lifeless, but it maybe wasn't at the same level as we have seen previously. When it comes to the third line, this is where we started to get a few of these newer players. Of course, Gushchin did still play yesterday, but then we also have Lawrence and Bowman. Let me first talk about Gushchin, who actually was the leading scorer here tonight for the San Jose Sharks with a goal and 2 assists. A very nice game for Gushchin. I had mentioned in the previous one that he had a couple of decent plays here or there, but nothing super consistent. And you could almost say that that was kind of the case here tonight as well, although there were more of those decent plays, even if it wasn't super consistent. But that's really what Gushchin's game seems to be. He might have like 1 or 2 shifts where you don't really notice him much on the ice, but then he'll come on for that third shift and suddenly he'll just fly around, making all these plays, making all these moves. He's a very slick player, I guess would be the correct word to do this. He has very soft hands, is I guess the way to put that there, and just generally is a skilled type of player. We're just needing a bit more consistency from Gushchin if he wants to be able to try and not necessarily crack the team this year, but be in line over these next couple of years to be competitive for a spot on the Sharks main roster. When it comes to the other 2 players on his line, not super noticeable, I would say. I did kind of like Lawrence's performance. I would have actually preferred had we seen Mitchell Russell stay in the lineup from the previous game, because I thought he was rather solid, but he didn't actually get the call here tonight. Lawrence did. I don't think Lawrence did a particularly bad job, but he wasn't anything super impressive. Bowman, I thought, was even more unnoticeable than Lawrence. On the fourth line, I actually thought the fourth line stood out in a pretty positive way, like it did in the previous game. Obviously, we saw a couple of changes. No Adam Raska here tonight, which I was also rather surprised about, but I feel as though maybe Raska is falling in the same kind of situation as Scott Reedy does. Reedy sat out this game, but that's mostly because you don't necessarily need to see that much more from Reedy, because you're already kind of knowing what to expect, and maybe that is indeed the case as well with Adam Raska, so you're trying to get a couple of other good looks at it. So let's start off here with Max Mchugh, who I thought actually had a pretty solid game here tonight. Also seems to be, like I've mentioned multiple times for a bunch of other prospects, seems to be in line to be the type of guy who's not going to be amazing offensively for you, but he can be quite solid defensively, and maybe he's in line for a potential 4th line spot over these next few years if he continues to develop in this way, because he had a decent knack for that defensive ability. And then when it comes to these other 2 players, I also want to mention Hamalek. He was a player who I honestly haven't been super impressed with over these past few years. Was drafted in the 2nd round by the San Jose Sharks in the 2019 entry draft, and he's never really made much of an impression on me, or at least not much of a good impression on me. Here tonight, maybe that was a change. This is actually one of the very few Sharks players who I thought was actually not so great in the first, but got better as the game wore on. Most of the Sharks players were very good in the first, but in the second and third period, and kind of take it or leave it. Hamalek was actually rather the opposite. I thought the first period was not good, but the second and third were much improved. So I guess that was nice to see as a potential first step in trying to impress me in his development, I guess. And then the final player on this line, I actually had to take a look because I didn't even remember much of anything of seeing Lewinsky here. He was in the game, let's just say. On the defensive side of things, half of the defensive core from last game was actually swapped out, but we had a couple of names to stay on. Of course, the first being Ryan Merkley, who I thought had himself a very strong game. I talked about Merkley, of course, in the previous one, and I said he had a lot of high-end talent. He showcased that in that particular game, but there were also multiple misplays, a sort of Brent Burns-esque style of game. But here tonight, I thought he really cleaned things up. Still had a few very nice offensive plays. There was one in particular where he picks up the puck in the defensive zone and just runs through every single Avalanche player and gets a good chance on net, splitting the defenseman and everything, Connor McDavid style, although of course in a rookie tournament and not actually in the NHL pulling off this move. But I also thought he eliminated a lot of those defensive errors. Still a couple of things, but that's going to happen to pretty much every single defenseman. But I don't think it was the Brent Burns-esque game that we saw from the previous one. So very nice to see that improvement from him here tonight. Maybe there was even that sort of conversation to put in a bit more effort here that came between him and the coaching staff. We also saw Jake Furlong actually get promoted up to the first pairing with Merkley. So Cicek gets the night off, and it is Furlong coming in. He was on the third pairing in the previous game, and clearly he did enough, similar to what Cardwell was, to get promoted up with Merkley. I thought he had a pretty solid game. I wasn't necessarily super impressed. Like, I didn't notice a ton from him in the previous one, as opposed to many other people seem to have, and I still haven't necessarily noticed a ton from him in this game. But considering the fact that he is, I believe, one of the youngest players here at this Rookie Faceoff tournament, it's actually a pretty good start to his development career. Then the other defenseman who remained in the lineup was Montana Onyebuchi. I didn't think too much of him in the previous game, but I thought he was actually much better here tonight. Scored a goal, of course, but also was making a couple of solid plays that I was relatively impressed with. But if there was one defenseman who really caught me by surprise here tonight, was actually his partner, was Guriev. I thought Guriev was really flying, especially in that first period. Really caught my eye multiple times, kind of like how Russell did in the previous one, a player who I really wasn't expecting to see much of. I barely even knew who this was coming into this game, and now he's someone who is definitely much more so on my radar. And then when it comes to the third defensive pairing, the major thing I really noticed about these two, in particular, I would say Mayer, was that he is a big guy who takes a lot of penalties, really gets into the physicality of things, and will probably try to stay out of the box, or hopefully should try to stay out of the box more in the future. And finally, when it comes to the goaltenders, we of course had Beaupit starting as well as Goodrow backing it up, but once again the Sharks decide to commit to just one goalie the entire time, so it is Beaupit who gets all 60 minutes here tonight. A pretty solid performance from him, I would say. He let in only a single goal here tonight, and the only one was on a 5-on-3 that he essentially had no chance on. I was rather impressed with Beaupit's positioning here tonight. If there was one thing that I'd say he probably had to work on, was a bit more of his awareness. I felt as though even though his positioning was solid, which allowed him to make the save, there were times where he couldn't necessarily locate the puck super fast after, and he was I guess not lucky in a way, but I guess kind of lucky that his team was able to clean up the rebounds in front of him, and the Avalanche weren't able to get too many of those second and third opportunities. Otherwise, we may have been talking about a different score for this game. But that will do it for this review. The Sharks will be back in action, not tomorrow. Of course, they will have that day off, but they will finish off the Rookie Faceoff tournament with Game 3 on Monday. Class dismissed.